Okay, so we are here today on October 22nd, the International Day of Action Against Police Brutality, Repression, and the Criminalization of a Generation. Before we start our remarks today, we're going to be welcomed by a Grand Chief from this territory. Thank you, Grand Chief Savannah McGregor.
Koikakana, hello everybody. I am here today to welcome my friends onto my unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. It is very unfortunate that we have to be here all together to discuss and share the truths of their lived experiences of their loved ones. And I'm really going to just share the floor and just speak briefly to let time for the families to adequately share what they need to share and state with the population of Canada. Also and my main point that I want to bring forward is that we need a national inquiry on law enforcement, municipal police, city police, and RCMP that are murdering our people. There is no follow-up with leadership or justice committees for our unsolved murder cases, and our families and ourselves need concrete action so that they can finally find peace. Go ahead.
My name is Meenakshi Minow. I'm a community organizer and social worker who's been working alongside these families for several years. Thank you again to Grand Chief for welcoming us onto her territory. We're going to hear from several families that have been directly impacted by fatal police incidents, starting with Martha Martin, whose daughter Chantel Moore was killed by Edmundston Police in 2020.
Good afternoon. My name is Martha Martin. I come from Tlayoquet First Nations. I'm the mother of Chantel Moore and my son, Mike Martin. So my daughter's life was taken on June 4th of 2020. And 5 months later, I would lose my son in police custody. So today as we come and we join the families, it's been 4 years of dealing with coroners, lawyers. Today we come and discuss, dealing with, I'd hoped that we would have seen justice in 2024, and as time goes on, I feel like our numbers are going up. Thank you. And law enforcement is still not held accountable. We see no action. We're here to request a national inquiry on law enforcement across the country because it affects every one of our families. I thought this was going to be a little easier, sorry. I'm going to take a little break.
It's obviously a very emotional subject for these families who I think we can all feel confident thought that there would be answers and justice far earlier. We're talking to moms who have been surviving this for years now. The next speaker we're going to hear from is Claudette Clayton-Beals, whose daughter, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, was killed by the Toronto Police Service in 2020.
Hi, I'm Claudette Clayton-Beals. In 2020, I made a wellness check call. I'm asking for help for my daughter. And 6 police officers came into my house, and my daughter lost her life that day. So actually what I'm morally concerned about is police reform. I feel that the police need to be properly educated. I don't understand why anybody would put a gun in somebody's hands that has not been properly trained. And this seems to be a very big problem here in Canada, actually all over the world. So these guys really have to be trained properly. You cannot put guns into people's hands and allow them to come out and take the law into their own hands, because that is actually what's going on. 9 Indigenous people just lost their lives within the last 6 weeks. And everybody already knows that the police will be cleared on this, because that is what the SIU does. They clear police, okay? First of all, you should never have police officer investigating other police. You need to give that to civilians. You hire civilians and you bring them in to do the same job. Okay, because like I don't understand why people don't understand what the police does to these families. It's a nightmare. Us trying to live this life. We're out here fighting all the time. And the more we fight, it just really seems like the more of our young people, our young generation, seems to lose their lives. And it's only that we want things to be proper and not the way they're going on. So it's really, really hard, and it's extremely hard for me. And I work with a lot of families, and I know how they feel, because I feel the same way. Do you know, when I go to sleep at night, and I wake up in the morning, I'm not sure if any of my kids are going to even be around, because I'm terrified. Because I've seen how police officers could come into my home and kill my child for absolutely nothing. My daughter, Regis Kochansky-Paquette, she should be still alive. She did nothing wrong, okay? And they threw her off the balcony, 24 flights, and they got away with it. The SIU cleared them and said they did nothing wrong. Of course they did something wrong, and they're still doing it wrong. When does this stop?
Thank you, Claudette, and I want to reiterate what she just mentioned about 9 Indigenous people who were killed in the last 6 weeks. 9 identified Indigenous people. That includes John Wells from the Blood Tribe, killed by Calgary police on September 18th. An unknown man killed by Winnipeg police on September 15th. Ron Skunk, killed by OPP on September 14th. Danny Knife, killed by Saskatchewan RCMP on September 8th. Iggy Dedam, killed by New Brunswick police on September 8th. Jason West, killed by Windsor police on September 6th. Tammy Bateman, killed by Winnipeg police on September 3rd. Haas Lightning Saddleback, killed by Alberta RCMP on August 30th. Jack Charles Pichet, killed by Saskatchewan RCMP on August 29th. And what these women standing behind me have been fighting for is a basic recognition of the epidemic of police violence that is faced by Black and Indigenous families across Canada. 9 deaths in 6 weeks should have been a wake-up call. It should have been a call from federal leaders to actually take action, and we are also here demanding a public inquiry into all police-involved deaths across Canada, regardless of jurisdiction, regardless of police force. These families have come together because they are all united in their grief. I'm going to now invite Laura Holland, mother of Jared Lowndes, who was killed by Campbell River RCMP on July 8th, to speak.
My name is Laura Holland. I'm from the Wet'suwet'en territory, and my clan is Luxilliu. The RCMP killed my son on July 8th, 2021 in Campbell River, BC. And since then, I have been united with families across Canada, and especially my friend Martha Martin. We have been very close, and we have worked hard together to demand justice for our children. And what we realize is that there is no justice. It's impossible to get justice in this country. And what we want to do is some healing, and we know that that's impossible too, because without justice, there is no healing. And we are so tired because the provinces, the provincial governments are not paying attention to us. In BC, the NDP leadership had at one point worked at Pivot, and he worked with a family from Prince George that was killed by the RCMP. So he knows what all the things are that are wrong. He knows all the injustices that are happening. And he still refuses to meet with us. He still refuses to talk to us. And we're tired. When we heard about the 6 in 11 days, the 6 Indigenous lives killed in 11 days, we talked on the phone. And then a couple days later, we talked again. And this time it was 11 Indigenous lives in 14 days. And that sent us reeling. I don't think you can imagine the kind of pain and suffering that families go through. Like when the police kill, unaccountable police kill one member in your family, they kill your whole family. So many people are grieving. Like all the 11 families, I can't imagine like the amount of pain. Like it's so compounded. And it's been like this since the beginning of Canada. And it's time that it stops. We need someone who has a political will. And that means we need people. We need people like you. We need people on board with us. And we need someone to have a political will to make some changes. Because there are so many people who are dying here in this country by law enforcement, whether if that's on the streets or in jails. And the numbers of women in law enforcement incarcerated is going up. We couldn't even get the government to look for our missing and murdered women in landfills. And I did the work with the missing and murdered women in the inquiry and the Picton inquiry. I know how hard it is. I know how devastating this work is. And I've been doing this all my life. And I've been fighting for justice all my life. And now my son has been killed by the police. And he knew they were coming for him. Like, this is just unreal. This is surreal. So we need changes, and we need systemic changes. We need systemic changes from an unaccountable government. We need someone to listen to us. I think there's one party that has spoken out about what the CRU or CERG is doing on Wet'suwet'en and Yinta. I haven't heard any other political parties talking about it. I'm just devastated. This should have been a political agenda for the elections. And, you know, the alert was made. We knew that there were 11 people killed. 11 Indigenous lives were taken. And there's no action. You know, this is ridiculous. This should be like a state of emergency. This is a state of emergency for us. Yes. It's a state of emergency for Indigenous people. We're being killed on the streets, in our homes, and everywhere. And no one is saying anything. No one cares. We want you to care. Even if you don't care, at least do something. Say something. Speak up. Stand with us. It's time.
We can take questions now. Go ahead.
Thank you for all being here and sharing your stories. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, in response to the deaths of, I think at the time it was 9 First Nations people, says that there doesn't need to be an inquiry, there needs to be accountability. Kind of saying that there's been reports about how police have handled these things in the past and that should be followed rather than have a new one. What is your response to?
When the missing and murdered women...
To the mic.
Oh. When women were being murdered and going missing in Canada, Indigenous women at an alarming rate, nobody paid attention. There should have been accountability then, and there wasn't. And we had to fight like hell. We had to fight really hard for years to ask for an inquiry. My friend and my cousin, Gladys Raddick, did many walks across this country. They walked for justice. They fought hard. We all fought hard. And we had to have an inquiry before we had any kind of accountability. And we're still waiting. We're still waiting. We want some justice. We want some accountability.
I think in response to the call, specific and clear call that's coming for these families, which is a public inquiry, this is also an invitation for the federal government to reckon publicly with the statistics that are often obscured. Many times when Indigenous people are killed by police, they remain unidentified, as is the case with one of the 9 people killed in that 20-day period that's been referenced numerous times. And a federal inquiry is also an opportunity for Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities to confront what is systemic violence. each of these families, Black and Indigenous families, Black and Indigenous community leaders, are continuing to fight for that basic recognition, and siloing it into individual cases, such as looking at one individual being murdered by the police, does not reflect the totality of this. And as Laura Holland mentioned, this violence against Black and Indigenous people is actually quite fundamental to Canada, and it is actually a part of how this state exists. The state exists because Indigenous people are under constant threat of police death and police fatality.
And how are you meeting with any of the ministers or opposition parties about this issue?
No. They won't meet with us.
So we've made a public call. We've made a public call to the Minister of Public Safety, Dominic LeBlanc, and RCMP Commissioner Mike Duhem, but so far no response.
So you've made formal requests for meetings with them?
We've not made formal requests. We have invited them through a public statement.
What would you like to see a public inquiry look like specifically, if the government was to call one?
Do you want to speak to that? Do you two want to speak to that? Go for it. You want me to? Okay. I think in thinking through that question, we have to also understand that when families like this are speaking out, when they're coming to Parliament Hill, this is all done out of pocket. And so to ask them to imagine what a federal inquiry looks like also needs to think about what are their basic needs that need to be met. Because I know that for each of these families, not only are they responding to the deaths of a loved one, they're also actively and constantly triaging their other family members, right? Because we're talking about families that have been systemically impacted by colonization. So it's not just looking at what does an inquiry do, it's looking at what are the basic necessities that the state needs to provide so that people can even think about what justice looks like. How do you even think about justice when you have to struggle to pay your rent and bury your son and pay for funeral costs, host a GoFundMe, come out and plead for people to open up their pockets? So I think what we need to start with is public legal funding to even basically support survivors of police violence. None of these women have access to lawyers unless they pay out of pocket. And the cost of litigating, whether it's a provincial police force, a municipal police force, or a federal police force, are astronomical. So you're asking people who are already poor to come out, fundraise, and then conceptualize an inquiry. And really, this inquiry should be about ensuring their basic needs are met so that they can even come to the table, right? We have a government that systemically deprives people so that they can't access justice. When you ask us, has the government agreed to meet with them? Where would these women start? As Black and Indigenous women coming to Parliament Hill, where would they start? Who is taking their calls? Who is taking their calls in this building? Like, they're all in the media continuously. They have to be. That's what you have to do if you want people to even remember the names of your loved ones. And we're talking about a political landscape post-George Floyd when there was so much attention and so much hope on what could be ended in 2020. And 4 years later, these families still have to come here and plead, not only for a basic meeting, which is a pathetic response by a government official, but also for something that should have been considered years ago. And yes, there are recommendations, and yes, there have been findings about systemic injustice, but still no police force has actually addressed the root causes of police violence, because it's actually not just a policing issue. It is an issue that's fundamental to Canada.
I take your point that there's a lot of barriers that a lot of families are facing as they just try to advocate for their family members, but you are calling for a public inquiry. And so public inquiries look very different, of course. You know, we have one on foreign interference. We, of course, had the MMIWG inquiry. So I guess my question is just, what would you like to see it look like? And I take your point that you would like support for survivors, but what would you like to see it actually look like in terms of who is gathered, what is discussed, what is the end goal? Just so people can kind of conceptualize what it is that you would like to see in an inquiry if one were to be called.
I'm going to look to these mothers again because they are the ones who've been in the streets and been in the meetings to tell us, what do you want from this federal government?
I want, first of all, provinces to look at what's going on in their province. I want them to look at all the police killings. I want them to fairly look at all the police killings. And like we go to inquests and inquest after inquest after inquest, and we have all these recommendations. We're drowning in recommendations. They're killing us in recommendations also. It's another tool that they use to shut us up and keep us quiet because, oh, we've made a recommendation. We want to see these recommendations become implemented through, it could be a public inquiry, but we want to see it happen. We want to have police held accountable in the public's eyes. We want to know who did the shooting, who did the killing, why did they do it. We want to know, because if I went and killed somebody, my name would be all splashed all over the place. It would be everywhere. Every dirty thing about me would be splashed all over the place because they would want to control the narrative and I would be a bad guy. But we want to see all the truth. We don't want to hear all the negative things about our family members. We want to hear the positive things about them too because these are human beings. These are our children. These are people that we love dearly. So we want the provinces to start looking at, how did the police do this? How did they kill them? What are the recommendations? And we want Canada to do a federal inquiry too, because why would we do this individually? Because there's so many things that are individual when we know it's systemic. We have to.
So for myself, you know, I've met with several of the families and it never gets easy, you know, and I think when we look at justice, you know, we're asked, what does justice look like for us? But we're still having injustice. So, you know, that's such a broad spectrum when you say, what does it look like? Or, you know, we think about, you know, better training, you know, and is it really necessary, you know, like where we're having police officers who are doing wellness checks and we know they're not certified to do them. You know, I had the pleasure to work actually with the Victoria Chief Dalmanic, and, you know, I was very fortunate he came to talk with me and he had listened to my story about my daughter and how her life was taken. And so doing that, he had mentioned that it inspired him to want to do better within his policing. So, you know, he had went through Vancouver Island Health Authority and, you know, applied for funding to get 2 psychiatric nurses in his police department. And that took almost 3 years, but he did it, you know, and this is something that, you know, maybe we could look across the board, you know, like mental health is affecting everyone and we shouldn't be dying because we're in a crisis. You know, imagine you're in that crisis and you're reaching out, or you're concerned for your safety and somebody else, the people you call to come and protect you are the ones that are taking your lives. You know, in 2024, why are our policemen not wearing cameras, every one of them, body cams? It's accountability for them and it's safety for us as well. You know, I think about all these things, you know, when my daughter was shot and killed by the Edmundston police, the police officer was back to active duty. How is that even possible? Like, there's no psych evaluations done, because I'm 4 years into losing my daughter and my son, and I struggle every day. My mental health is spiraled bad, and you know, every time we gather, we add more names. So when when we talk about just, you know, accountability, what does that look like? Body cams, are we going to have consequences if you turn them off? It's a big topic that I think needs to be addressed, and it's not just, you know, every province. It's got to be, we've all got to come together, and because this, we've had enough. You know, we're in 2024, and our children are dying at the hands of law enforcement. So we're here to say we've had enough. We want to see action. You know, we've stopped giving us recommendations and then filing them away, because what good are they doing if they're not implemented?
Okay, so for right now, I would just like to see the police put down their guns until they're trained properly, because they're not doing a good job. So I feel you bring in all these new rookies and you're putting guns in their hands, and our children are losing their lives. So maybe the police have to put down the guns until they're trained properly, and then come back out and try to do a better job. Because right now, there is no justice. We're not having that, because we're just having, so many people are being killed here.
The laws are different in different provinces, and like when a police officer takes someone's life, they should be able to collect all that evidence, and it should go directly to court. It should not go to an IIO or an SIU or any other body. All the evidence collected should go directly to court. And there are so many things that we need to look at that happen after that. And all these recommendations that have been made. And we need to have more lawyers' voices too, because there's so many lawyers who have talked about what's wrong with the system. And they know that there's changes that need to be made. So we also need to have their input. I think that if we were looking at a federal or provincial inquiry, you know, again, we would be scrambling for money, and who would be interveners for us? You know, so we would have to even look at how do we change a public inquiry? How do we make it possible for families' voices to be heard and taken seriously? How do we make that possible? So there's a lot of things that we have to think about and that people have to consider. I don't make up the laws. I'm not a political scientist. I don't know. And I'm not the one who can twist the laws and change them to whatever I want them to be. Because that's what we see and hear a lot, is the narrative changes quite often. And, you know, oh, it was this, oh, it was that, no, it's this. But so we need someone who's going to change that narrative for us. We need to hear the truth. That's what we need. And that would help with the beginning of healing, and that would be the beginning of justice. Because when police are gunning down people, like in the killing spree that they just went through, we can't have healing. We can't have justice, because we're reeling.
Do you feel like maybe the MMIWG inquiry would be an example of how you would like something done? Is it a matter of you want an inquiry to look into every individual case where someone has died while involved with a police officer? Would you like better data collection? Is that a concern?
There is a nationally coordinated civilian data tracking project, Tracking Injustice. Again, I think each of those inquiries, specifically the MMIWG inquiry, has come with some serious issues as well, because we are talking about forcing families through a colonial process without due attention to the resources that they need in order to participate. And while the call for a public inquiry, this is the first time that these families have come together to make that call for a federal inquiry, I think that they're going to need time to also consider, what does that look like? What does it look like to actually impose an Indigenous justice on an inquiry, rather than having Canada impose its rule on these families in order to proceed? Because as devastating as it is for these families to grieve each day, to have to go up against the federal government and be tormented by that process would be another heartbreak to endure. Just before we close, I do want to say that, again, today is the International Day Against Police Brutality, Repression, and the Criminalization of a Generation. And there are 8 families that have traveled to Ottawa to meet, to gather, to unite around this national call. They will be speaking outside of West Block after this press conference, and they will also be holding a candlelight vigil at the Human Rights Memorial this evening, again calling attention not just to their own children, not just to the 9 Indigenous people killed in a 20-day period in Canada, but for all Black and Indigenous people who have been impacted by police violence in this country.
Thank you.